Hello, Jeando.
Good morning, Kevin.
So, last video, we've been talking about breathing, Alexander's idea of breathing, and you touched upon the difference between the straight neck model and the straight sternum model, and you were showing some diagrams. So, I was wondering if we could talk more about that.
Yes, yes. There are so many things to say about it. And the very big question that started all this was finding for me a proper definition for lengthening the spine. Uh, I thought that because my teachers had somatic training with second generation teachers or first generation teachers themselves, they felt in their hands what was the proper organization of the parts so that we could speak about lengthening the spine. And there are some somatic teachers that are really confident that they have it when other haven't, and they are very confident that they can manipulate people into the proper lengthening spine position, if you want. So um, I started to have doubts because I was reading extensively, first of all, what Alexander was discussing in his books, and I was watching his video, his films, every images I could find about him, and I started to see the obvious. That is the organization of the movement of the part of the torso as done by Alexander is very, very different from what you would find in any modern Alexander technique teacher nowadays. And as the spine does not finishes with the mechanism of the torso, of course, you will discover that the neck, as you would say, the neck position relatively to the torso is not the same. Has nothing to do with it. It's different. So there are some teachers, I've heard some teachers, well, not many, but I've heard some say that Alexander in fact was wrong. Alexander organization of the movement was not proper. He was in fact projecting his head too far forward. I've heard many ideas like this, but it never convinced me. I said, how do they know then? If they have been transmitted a proper position by feeling, how can they know that what Alexander reasoned out as the proper position or position of mechanical advantage, especially for breathing, could be wrong? Everything was strange. So after many years, I have collected data from every single book I could read, and I've started experiments and compared what could be said or seen in different techniques, like the singing techniques, because there is this component of breathing and this component of vocalizing that was very present. And so the bel canto was a great help with the idea, like we saw last time, of leaning forward of the upper torso, which is the opposite of the straight neck model. So let's go and see what we are discussing. So what is the straight neck model? Here it is. So I have taken 3 images. I could have taken 50 on the internet of modern Alexander teachers, and what the teacher on the left is doing with herself is more or less a copy cat of what she's doing to the other person. And in every situation we see people smiling and all is going well, all is fine. Yes, but there is a constant, and the constant is that the sternum is always very far inclined backward at the top, so that the neck is really straight. Yes, and so this can be represented very easily. There is a relationship between the mechanism of the torso, because when the top of the sternum is moving backward relatively to the lower part of the sternum, there is an immediate effect on the spine because the sternum is articulated with the ribs. And when the first ribs is very further back than, for example, the sixth ribs, then of course you have a retraction of the upper thoracic spine. So the upper thoracic spine is very far back, and we create a very nice like straight shape between the middle of the torso and the top of the torso. It looks like lengthening. I agree. The person looks upright, really much upright. But there are things you will see that suddenly start to, become rather exaggerated. Like you will see the shape of the chin and the double chin, and the fact that the larynx is said to be protruding, and the distance between the chin and the larynx becomes smaller and smaller. These are all indication that we are in a very different condition from the straight sternum model. In the straight sternum model, of course, the upper thoracic spine is very far forward of the middle thoracic spine. To get the thoracic spine on the same level at the middle thoracic spine, of course, the person needs to pull the top of the sternum very far back in the movement. This is very different, and this is corresponds to, in fact, what Alexander was seen performing not only for himself, but also, as you can see, how he expands his thumb away from the little finger to create the curve is clearly, rotating the rib cage in order to obtain a system where, if you look at the student or the pupil from the side, you will see that the chin is very far forward of the front of the torso. While in all these images, you will see that the chin is most of the time further back than the middle of the torso. This is what I call the straight neck model. There is a retraction of the neck. The position of the neck is very constrained backward, and it looks very straight. So the question is this, lengthening the torso. So when I started to observe, there were many different indications. One of these indications is not coming from the top of the torso. It's coming from the lower part of the torso. And so Alexander described the torso. He says here, so I'm just going to repeat what he says. He says, let us for a moment think of the thoracic and abdominal cavities as one fairly stiff oblong rubber bag filled with different parts of the working machine, which are interrelated and interdependent, and which are held in position by their attachment to the different parts of the inner surface of this bag. We will then suppose, for the sake of our illustration, that the circumference of the inner upper half of this bag is 3 inches more than that of the lower half. As long as this general capacity of the bag is maintained, the working standard of efficiency of the machinery is indicated as the maximum. There is a following idea. Let us, in our mind eye, decrease the capacity of the upper part of the bag and increase that of the lower half until the inner circumference of the latter is 3 inches more than the former. We can at once picture the effect of the whole of the vital organs therein contained, their general disorganization, the harmful irritation caused by undue compression, the interference with the natural movement of the blood, of the lymph, and of the fluids contained in the organs of digestion and elimination. In fact, we find a condition of stagnation, fermentation, etc., causing the manufacture of poison which more or less clog the mental and physical organism, and which constitute a process of slow poisoning. So you may wonder what is the relationship between a straight neck and this undue compression and this undue width of the lower part of the whole bag of the torso. And in fact, there is absolutely one. I've taken this image from, well, I think an English website of the modern Alexander technique, where there is a picture of the ideal posture. And, well, the ideal posture is ideal for representing the straight neck posture. The neck is really straight, and there is the first sign is that the sternum bone is really inclined backward at the top. So the top of the thoracic spine is nearly in line with the middle of the thoracic spine. And this has different consequences. This is a certain poise of the chest. Yes, the chest is clearly rotated backward and upward at the top and forward and down at the bottom. And so the consequences, of course, are the one we know: the protruding shoulder blades, the shortened lower back, the fact that the hips and lower torso are too far forward of the fulcrum, the person is leaning forward with the lower torso and leaning back with the upper torso to compensate. But there is something you must understand here, is that if you, well, reproduce that coordination of movement that lead to that posture. That is, the person has been doing some movements in order to obtain that posture. Well, you will find a very interesting effect on the lower rib cage. When you protrude the lower rib cage forward, which is exactly a synonym of another action. That is, when you pull the upper sternum backward relatively to the lower sternum, you will find that suddenly you are expanding the lower rib cage. We have been discussing this idea of primary act, primary movement in every act. And apparently the primary movement in every act here is to get an ideal posture in which the lower rib cage is protruded very far forward in order to get that inclination of the sternum. And if you were to place your hands around the side of the rib cage at the height of the lower rib cage, and it's an experiment I ask all my students to perform. I ask them to open thumb and index, place them on both sides of the lower rib cage, with the thumb touching the back ribs and the index is touching the front ribs, relatively just below the sternum height. And I ask them simply to try and get the lower sternum very far forward of the upper sternum. And they discover that this, in fact, produces some effects. So there is a cause and effect relationship that you cannot miss. It's impossible to miss it. Alexander is absolutely right. You can expand the lower half of the bag of the torso, and this expansion leads to all sorts of difficulties. That means that to expand the lower rib cage, you're narrowing the back, you're protruding the shoulder blade, yes, you're retracting the neck. And we will see that this retraction of the neck is very important to understand Alexander's difficulty in breathing or difficulty in vocalization that started these experiments. And so we are here into what Alexander called the wrong poise of the chest and the wrong pose of the torso. We understand now that when we discuss the expansion of the rib cage, it's not as well, the people that are nowadays discussing about the primary movement in every act, it has nothing to do with breathing directly. breathing is a secondary activity or tertiary activity for Alexander. Before anything that has to do with breathing, we must teach the pupil to change the poise of the chest and the wrong pose of the torso. So I have taken another image from well, a website in the States and it's quite interesting because this Alexander teacher is, I think, a former dancer, and so many people believe that dancers know things about how the organism is supposed to function because they have so much experience in moving around, in jumping, in doing all sorts of things. And so we see Claire Maxwell here showing how to well, she's in fact going up onto the toes and in order to prepare for squatting. And well, of course, we see an extreme straight spine. She's really protruding the lower rib cage forward, really tilting the sternum back. And of course, the consequences are for all to see. But there is one consequence that started to attract my eye. It's the chin, and the position of the middle torso relatively to the chin. It seems that on this image, of course, the chin is very far backward relatively to the middle torso. If you wanted an example of what we mean by protruding the middle torso, this is protruding the middle torso relatively to the chin, relatively to the face. Yes, and so we get these two consequences that are cause and effect relation with the movement, well, guided and performed by the teacher. We see the undue expansion of the lower rib. We see the narrowing and the shortening of the lower back. The spine is completely arched. Fine. Well, there is, of course, a difference. When you look at what Alexander is performing, you see that the straight sternum model is completely different, and it's different in the sense that we can start to see that, wow, the chin looks very different, and it's very, very far forward of course, the middle torso. So, but for me, it started to make sense, and I started to see that, wow, there were monumental differences between the initial Alexander technique, as taught by Alexander, even when he was manipulating people, and how people are manipulated nowadays. And so here is Claire again, and she's showing the same thing, and that is what attracted me. I started to see the double chin, the very short distance between the point of the chin and the sternum and the sternum bone. It's easy to replicate that same organization of the parts. It's not specific to a person. It's something everybody can do. If you get the sternum, top of the sternum, very far back from the lower sternum, so you are, that means that you're arching the back. You don't even need to shorten the neck by lifting the arms backward like this. But, well, it helps, of course, to get the posture, imagine. And so I started to look at it and I say, wow, this is quite interesting. I'm starting to look at somebody that is obviously, well, doing something. And the manner of the movements is such that the person is much closer to a very, very high larynx than a low larynx. So when we discuss a double chin, we discuss the position of the larynx. And I became very, very interested in the position of the larynx. Well, and certainly so because I started to read Delsart, and Delsart has a few texts which are relating his first experiments. And he started to experiment because he was losing his voice, and he was desperate to find a technique a way to consciously direct his activity while he was singing and while he was not singing, in order to protect his voice. We discussed this idea of vocal protection that was not anything new at the time Delsart in 1833, when Delsart really started to investigate. It was not something new. Well, at least in France, there was a very, very important school of singing, which is the Italian school of singing. There were people like Lamperti and José Garcia II that were well-known figure in Paris, and they were teaching vocal protection. We discussed that in our last episode, and vocal protection is, of course, leaning forward with the upper torso relatively to the lower sternum. It's exactly the opposite of what you see represented on these two pictures, where the teacher advocates movements to get free. Yeah, this is exactly the symptom of vocal neglect, of difficulty in breathing, and as you will see, also difficulty in using the larynx for its primary function. Because most people have this idea of the use of the larynx. So the larynx, you can see here on these images, the larynx is a complex system that is at the top of the airways, which is at the top of the trachea. It's a very complex structure that is part of the tongue. It's attached to the tongue at the top, and of course it's attached to the lungs at the bottom. I've taken these pictures from a scientific article that is absolutely not discussing anything else than vocalization. These are not supposed to explain anything about good use or wrong use. They are just interested in what happens when a person is well, vocalizing some E or some U sound. So this is what we see. Yet, for me, these images immediately attracted my attention. Why? Well, because first of all, we see that the poor singer or vocalist has a straight spine model. We see that the spine is really straight, and the larynx is nearly straight also, but nearly. Why? Because you must understand that the origin of the trachea is the tube that is in fact communicating with the lungs and coming right up to the mouth and nose, the airways. And as you can see, the tube is of course inclined backward at the bottom. And in this case, we see that the distance, because of the straight neck posture, we are going to start to notice that, yes, again, we see the double chin posture. The double chin posture that you were looking at here is more or less the same. There is very little distance between the chin and the larynx. As a result, you get what we people call double chin. And at first, I thought, like most people, that the double chin is just a condition of age. It's because you're getting older, you're getting maybe a bit fatter, and you get a double chin. That's it. In fact, not at all. You can create the double chin at will. I hope many people will be pleased and overjoyed that it's possible to create a double chin at will. In fact, what I tend to say to my pupil, that if you can create a double chin at will, there should be the possibility to imagine a technique, a reasonable technique, where you are making the double chin disappear at will. And I really think that it is exactly what Alexander had well, rediscovered. Yes, we see here, of course, that we have a system where the larynx, of course, is involved, and it's involved in vocalization. It's absolutely obvious. We see that the hyoid bone distance from the larynx itself can be made to change, and that is used in order to, in fact, with the position, of course, of the tongue, but the combination of these different movements of the parts of the voice box and the movements of the tongue produce different sounds. Fine. Yes, but what we are interested in is not in the sounds we produce. We are interested in the manner of use of the torso in order to produce these sounds. And I can tell you for sure that in order to get a straight spine, a straight cervical spine like this, well, the vocalist has to organize the spine at the height of the upper torso. Everything comes from the poise of the chest. If you get a straight sternum, you will realize that this can only be with the the movement of the upper thoracic spine very far forward. If the movement of the thoracic spine is very far forward, well, the neck is going to be projected forward and up, and the head is going to, well, appear to be forward and up of the abdomen. Well, now, you must understand that you cannot have this kind of spine, of cervical spine, this kind of trajectory of the spine when you get that kind of direction. The spine is a solid object, it is made of solid objects. And so the logic wants that you cannot have a nearly straight vertical spine and a larynx that is at an angle like this if the person is using vocal protection, which is, you remember, lean forward with the upper chest relatively to the lower sternum. Some people think that this cannot be right because, of course, we do not see the gentleman leaning forward. And so the person is not objectively leaning forward. And that is absolutely correct. What is leaning forward is the upper thoracic spine, as it is seen here. And so this is exactly the opposite to this upper thoracic spine that is projected backward. So this cervical spine is obviously very straight, and as a result you get the double chin effect. So suddenly I started to think, well, that's very interesting, but why is it that Alexander suffered from voice problems? And I started to really think that, wow, I was missing something. There was something that was not clear. And of course, Alexander never talks about it directly, or Delsart, by the way, but it's the same. But suddenly I started to realize that what Delsart was discussing, which is the very high position of the larynx in vocalizing. In singing, there are different schools of singing, of course, but there is this idea that trained singers use a very a lower position of the larynx relatively to non-singers. Non-singers, I've got an example somewhere. I thought I had an example somewhere, and I haven't. I am sorry for that. This idea that the position of the larynx is useful for singing when it's slow. That's really Delsart that started me on this idea, because he really experimented how to get higher notes with a low position of the larynx. And this was the vocal protection he was looking for. It's very different from Alexander that says that in most people the larynx is depressed, which very often in his text means too low. So I was faced with contradiction. Vocal protection for Alexander seems to have the larynx very high, and vocal protection for Alexander and for all the the very great first bel canto teachers, it's very low. So somebody must be wrong. So who was it? And so I noticed that, of course, when the larynx is very high, you get the double chin effect. When the larynx is very high, you get breathing difficulties. And suddenly I started to think, so what is the larynx for? And that's when I started to think that and to read in most medical books relative to the basic functions of the larynx, that the basic function of the larynx was not for breathing or for vocalizing. Of course, in the larynx you have the vocal folds that are the vibrating organs that allows us to, in fact, create speech and singing. Yes, but the first function of the larynx is not for breathing. The first function of the larynx is for swallowing. And so I started to study swallowing, and I noted, yes, that in most, like 99% of the illustration explaining swallowing, you get the straight neck model. Well, it's because the straight neck model is everywhere. There are very, very few examples of people that are directing the movement of the torso so that the head could indirectly, appear to be forward and up of the abdomen. Most people are retracting. When they take a breath, most people are really actively moving the upper sternum backward, therefore moving the top of the thoracic spine back, and the cervical spine ends up being very straight. Yeah. So for swallowing, well, there is no discussion about the probable height of the larynx. Swallowing is a basic function where the larynx has to come very, very close to the pharynx. It's absolutely obvious that the movement of the larynx for swallowing is upward. But not only. It's upward and it's also forwards. You find that when the person is swallowing is the moment when the larynx is closest to the chin. So I started to understand a few more things. It's like when you look at these images, you think that, okay, I have a straight spine, and so now the chin is very far away from the abdomen. The chin is very far back from the abdomen. So I am creating a condition where the pharynx, which is a tube made of muscle, is like shortest, and the elastic tension in the muscle is gone. Yes, because when you shorten a muscle, the pharynx is a tube made of muscle. When you shorten the pharynx, of course, the activity has to be produced by contraction, shortening contraction of the muscle, because the stretch that happens only when the geometric conditions are sufficient, which is that when the larynx is very far away from the chin and from the mouth, well, then this is not happening. And why? It's because when you swallow, what is happening is that the pharynx, the back of your mouth, is going to narrow from every direction, from the back, from the sides. It's narrowing to, in fact, create a very nice canal for the liquid or for the food you're going to swallow. The less air possible has to be ingested with every gulp. Otherwise, you get all sorts of digestive difficulty. You should not swallow air. You should swallow liquid or solids, or a mix of liquid and solids. So when you vocalize with a position of the larynx so high, you are creating many sorts of difficulties. first of all, the opening for the air, because the person is not swallowing here, the person is vocalizing. The opening for the air is in fact closed or half closed, because the wall of the pharynx are not stretched, but you are not taking a bolus of food. So the muscular contraction that are closing the pharynx are not in action, and so for the first reason you are depressing the pharynx. Depressing means that the tension in the walls are not pushing the walls away from one another. They are tending to collapse the wall. And so I think that when Alexander is talking about depressing the larynx, well, the larynx depression cannot be understood either in any other way than going down, because the larynx cannot be depressed. It's a solid box, while the pharynx is like a very floppy tube when it's not stretched. So there is a tendency to depress the pharynx, which is to reduce the airways, what we call patency, which is the opening. And when a person has a habit of reducing the patency, you will find that this reduction is not only in the nose or in the mouth, and you will find that at the end of every sentence, every breathing out, the person is going to sniff in air. Why is the person gulping air at the end of the sentence? Well, it's because the person feels that there is some obstruction. There is something that is preventing the air from simply entering the lungs. The air outside of the lungs is under a certain pressure. We call the atmospheric pressure. If you make a movement of breathing out, you must understand that suddenly there is less pressure inside the lungs after breathing out than when there was air in. So if you just open the airways, the atmospheric pressure will just balance. So the air will just fill the lungs. Why is it that Alexander was sniffing in air? Why was he swallowing air? Well, because he felt the need to do so. And the need to do so had to do with what's happening in the tubes. There is also another thing that comes to mind, is that Alexander was swallowing very, very often when he had his voice trouble. It means that accelerating in the air, the sucker principle that he's talking about, we were discussing the sucker principle last time and the video before. The sucker principle is that in order to force the air in, because you must feel an obstruction, then the person is going to accelerate the air and create even more depression into the tubes, and this is the consequence of a certain condition of the tubes itself. So Alexander found that there was no help in trying to solve the effects. Blowing the nose, finding some sort of liquid to inhale, to get into, in order to clean the nose. No, he found he had to change the cause. And it comes to his mind this idea that the vocal protection he needed came not from how he was using his tongue, how he was in fact using the larynx directly, because you cannot direct the larynx directly. When a person, I can tell you, when a person is shown that she has a double chin, I think that the first thing she would like to do is to directly move the chin away and back. But that is, nobody knows how to do that. Yes, it's possible to do it indirectly. And the solution is not to move anything around the chin. It's to move the upper thoracic spine relatively to the middle thoracic spine so that we get out of the straight neck posture. And so Alexander started to, well, direct the movements of the different parts of the torso in order to get the head forward and up. And you can understand now why he says that you should never do something to get your head forward and up, because if you try to do something to get your head forward and up, you're going to start to think of moving the neck. And the neck is just a consequence. So it's a wrong understanding. If you want the head forward and up, you need to organize the movements of the torso so that your sternum is seen as straight from the side. That's it. It's the new idea. And when you start to observe medical text and you start to look at, for example, what is the larynx. This is a very nice drawing that I took from, well, a very interesting article, scientific article. But what we see here, a vertical larynx, a vertical neck. Yeah, I started to redraw these things to correspond with Alexander's orientation of the head forward and up. When the head is forward and up, the neck is forward and up. If the neck spine is forward and up, then you must understand that the back of the larynx and the back of the trachea is against the, well, the front of the cervical spine. So if the cervical spine is straight, you get that kind of image. If you start to have the head forward and up, and I said academic representation, this is absolutely not an academic representation. This is a representation of the upper airways by somebody that is teaching the initial Alexander technique and wants to get a straight sternum posture. The straight sternum posture is associated as a consequence with, well, a cervical spine that is directed forward and up at the top. And so you start to understand something is that when you are swallowing, studying swallowing, I think is a very, very important phase. Well, it was a very important phase for me, and any teacher that has postgraduate lessons with me will need to, well, hear this and need to understand what we are discussing here. So what for the moment we are discussing is that the first function of the larynx is for swallowing. The larynx was not invented to make sound. The larynx was invented to protect the airways from anything entering the canal when the person is ingesting food. We are made in such a way that the mechanism works with opposite movements. That is, there are movements of the larynx for breathing, and there are movements for the larynx for swallowing. So this, for me, ended the controversy as knowing who is right. Is it Delsart or is it Alexander? Should the larynx be up like Alexander apparently supposes, or should it be down like the bel canto and Delsart are really teaching? Well, it was absolutely clear that Delsart was right. Because swallowing, you see, is explained in details here. And it's Palmer. Palmer is a very important man to know when you want to understand swallowing. So if you go on the internet and you type J.B. Palmer, you will see many articles. This one is a rehabilitation of swallowing disorder due to stroke. And so he's explaining here swallowing. He says there is a complex, rapid, nearly synchronous series of events called the pharyngeal stage of swallowing. Yes, it's the stage where the food is reaching the back of the mouth. The pharynx is the tube between the front of the mouth where there is the tongue, and the tongue folds itself into a tube we call the pharynx. And so what happens when the food reaches the back of the mouth is that the soft palate rises, and contacts the posterior and lateral pharyngeal walls, which bulge inward. As I explained, when you swallow, the pharynx is going to narrow around the bolus of food. And when the soft palate rises, as is said, and contacts the posterior and lateral pharyngeal walls, this is an occlusion of the superior airways. It's necessary that, well, the soft palate goes up to close the nose opening. You don't want any food to creep up into the back of your nose. It's really not pleasant. And so everything is made for that narrowing of the passage. So when you want to swallow, the pharynx has to narrow. Yeah, the pharynx is very short, and when a muscle is very short, it bulges, and as it explains here, it's bulging inwards from the side and from the back. Well, you certainly wouldn't want this to happen when you're breathing, of course. When you're breathing, you want to open the airways. So what he says is that the cricopharyngeus muscle, which holds the pharyngeoesophageal segment close between swallow, now relaxes, and is calling to figure 1.6. I haven't got figure 1.6, but I can explain what we are discussing here. This is a picture, yes, of the cricopharyngeal muscle. You see this muscle? So above it, you have the pharynx. This is a muscle, a constrictor that is making the tube, the back of the tube of the pharynx. And below it, you see the esophagus. So the upper esophagus sphincter is this muscle that is mentioned by Palmer. And what he's saying is that at the moment of swallowing, when you in fact narrow the pharynx with muscular effort, when you bulge the pharynx from all sides to conduct the bolus of food to the back of the mouth, well, this muscle will relax, which is quite interesting, that when we are presented some drawings, nobody knows that this drawing shows swallowing, a swallowing phase. The 30 milliseconds where the esophagus is opening, because most of the time the picture should be more like the one I have redrawn here, where the cricoesophagus, yes, is absolutely contracted, and you see that the esophagus is totally flat. It's closed. That was is explained here. Yes, the cricopharyngeus muscle, which holds the pharyngoesophageal segment closed, which the pharynx and esophagus is closed between swallow. When you're breathing, you're not swallowing. When you're not swallowing, the pharyngoesophageal segment must be closed, not open. And so this comes interesting. You will see the hyoid bone and larynx move upward and forward toward the chin. Shortening the distance between the pharynx and the chin is very characteristic of swallowing proper. Yeah? This opened the pharyngoesophageal segment by pulling the cricoid cartilage, which is attached to the entire wall, the entire pharyngeal wall, away from the vertebral column and posterior pharyngeal wall. What we are discussing here is the fact that this esophagus is attached to the front of the vertebrae. When the person is directing the movement of the larynx upward and forward, as you can see here, what is happening is that, the pharynx is going away from the spine, and so it's stretching open the esophagus. So it's not not only going upward, that is going to promote the swallowing function, but it's also forward and upward. So suddenly I started to realize that when you see a person that is bringing the top of the sternum backward in order to get a straight spine while breathing and vocalizing, what you see is that person is in fact pulling the sternum forward and upward involuntarily and indirectly. I'm certain that the person doesn't want to swallow here. The person is vocalizing. So I'm certain the person is not in the swallowing phase. And we can be certain of this because the swallowing phase is a third of a second. So you cannot swallow and vocalize these vowel at the same time. It's impossible. It's one or the other. Yet the person is not swallowing. The person is breathing. Yet the person is creating the conditions that are similar to swallowing. The larynx is very far upward and forward. It's not done by the muscle of the pharynx at all. It's done by the movement that the person is creating with the middle torso and the upper torso. So I started to realize that this person is in half swallowing mode. This person is half obstructing the airways, which should be obstructed for swallowing. Yes, but the person is not swallowing. The person is making a sound. The person is vocalizing. The person is breathing. Yes, the person is breathing, but the larynx is very high and very close to the chin. So we can imagine, I don't want ever to be the bringer of bad news, but we can imagine that that person has, breathing difficulties and swallowing difficulties. Not because of what she's doing with this region. She doesn't even know she's doing something with that region. No, it's with her directions of the movement of the different parts of the sternum, of the torso, of course, and of the pelvis and legs. So we are now, we are confronted now with a new idea of the primary act in the primary acts in every activity. The primary act in every activity is, of course, to expand the torso, but not expand the torso with a simplistic idea of having a lateral extension of the ribs, of course. The new extension of the torso is obtained by the poise of the chest and the pose of the torso. This is true vocal protection in every act. So, is it somehow clearer?
Yes, that answers the question from the last time, yeah. And I also noticed that Alexander says, one of the quotes there, he says, in our mind's eye, if we imagine, and then he gives a visual analogy. And he also had the visual analogy before of he was asking people to do it, was to fold a piece of paper and put one on top of the other so you could see that one was shortened and one was longer to explain the lengthening of the spine. So it shows that he's using mental models the whole time, even though he doesn't talk about this explicitly, but his idea of lengthening the spine, it's visual. There's a way for it to look visually. He's not just going by the feelings of free or the feelings of up. Because when you have your neck pulled back in the straight neck position, you feel up. But if you look on images, you'll see that actually the distance between your height is less. It's actually shorter. You haven't gone up.
That's correct. Yeah. So the models are what Alexander, I think, talks about when he discusses reasoning from the wrong to the right. Yes. Reasoning is like this idea that when the bel canto teachers are talking about leaning forward with the upper torso relatively to the lower sternum, you must imagine what the person must be feeling. A person that has always believed that going up was to pull the upper torso backward. And that is a very strong experience that the person has repeated time and time again. Well, that person is living with the upper sternum very far backward with relatively to the lower sternum. Yet, when you are going to promote by any way, you can touch the person, manipulate the person, but I prefer to give directions, new orders of movements, so that the person start to experiment with what it is to move the middle torso backward and the upper torso forward. You must understand what the person is going to feel. The person will have the impression, very, very strong impression of leaning forward with the upper torso. But it does not show on the model, because on the model, the person is certainly not even yet vertical with the sternum. With my student, you have had the experience with me, we get that enormous impression of being too far forward with the upper torso. And most of the time when we get it, and we look at the video evidence, well, it seems that it is not even sufficient to get the upper thoracic spine and the cervical spine forward and up to open the airway sufficiently. So we are always in between two chairs, as if. That is, we want to discuss models, and we want to discuss reasoning. What is a reason technique for vocal protection, for airways opening? But we have also the fact that when we are experimenting with the movement, suddenly we feel. Suddenly we feel so strange. Alexander talks about fear of certain feelings. Well, I can swear, most of the teachers that have worked with me have manifested some fear of going that far forward and upward. It's not something that, oh yes, I discovered how nice forward and upward was. No, never. The person is going there like pushing against it all the time. I have to find all sorts of different tactics and things so that the person will accept to feel that wrong in order to get what we call the head forward and up, as an indirect consequence of the organization of the parts of the torso. So yes, there is this difficulty, this incredible effect of the technique, is that we are always confronted between what the model is proposing, what the model reasoned out should be, and what we tend to cling to, which is our feelings of straight, or feelings of being stable, or feelings of being correct or right. Yeah. So yes, Alexander is pointing, he was, I think, like you said, very, very interested in the mental model, in the reasoning, but at the same time, he was also very impressed by the experience. He's always talking about the experience. And the experience is unfortunately what you feel when you move in the way he recommended.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. For people watching, you can go underneath the video and there's a link to Jeando where you can book a lesson with him. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thanks, Kevin.